These entrepreneurs, very often, they also need to change institutions and rules so that their businesses can become more competitive. Female entrepreneurs generally do have other greater limitations in growing their businesses, whether it's access to finance, whether it's access to networks.
I understand you're connecting in your work the social movements and entrepreneurship.
That's right.
That's
Yes.
that's what I'm seeing. Maybe
Yes.
maybe you can just explain them for a minute. What how they connect and your your motivation. I mean, you're very passionate about this. No, your motivation about doing this. Yeah, maybe as a start.
I study social movements and entrepreneurs, but in the context of sustainable entrepreneurship, right? And so that context matters because sometimes they want to start new industries that on their own don't stand and are not cost competitive on their own. And so this is where the social movement comes in. The movement matters because very much is aligned with the values of the entrepreneurs. And so it can come in to help out in that, whether it's through policies, whether it is by creating customer awareness about the issues, whether it is through media and giving these new startups and new industries much more relevance and visibility. The movement can help this. But what I also find in some of my studies is that not only does the movement help the startups and new industries to begin, the new industries themselves can also shape the character of the movement as the industries start to grow.
Okay. So that leads to lots of interesting questions. So first of all, as you connect the social entrepreneurs with social movements, so I understand they're somewhat different than from other entrepreneurs in the sense that they see themselves on a mission. Let's say, is that the right word of saying it? To achieve more than just create a new business. No?
That's right.
Cool.
So when we look at entrepreneurs that want to bring impact and change, their pro-social motivation drives them to take on a different way of entrepreneurship. These entrepreneurs very often find themselves that they're not just starting businesses. They find themselves at a point where they also need to change institutions and rules so that their businesses can become more competitive, be able to grow and thrive down the line as well. They start something and they may realize, wait a second, when I do it this way, I'm not competitive. Some of them do feel a bit trapped. Now, there's a lot of win-win opportunities in the world, and I don't want to discount that. There's a lot of opportunities to do good for the environment and good for the economy, right? But the reality is that sometimes it also happens that a lot of opportunities are not win-win. They end up being a bit more like win-lose, right? If I do better for the environment and that comes at a greater cost, I'm going to be at a competitive disadvantage as a company, right? And it's what we sometimes have termed the green prison. Those who are greener are not necessarily the ones who win economically, but you can change the game so that you might end up winning.
So you talk about having to change some of the frameworks of an industry, maybe even institutions. Maybe you can give us some kind of an example, I think, to see this, and maybe even also let's say a word about. I assume that some of that will also be controversial in the sense of, if somebody goes out and changes the system.
Maybe when we think about changing the rules, very often what comes to mind, first of all, is, well, regulation, right? How do you change the rules? Well, you put in regulation in place, right? And that's one of the most formal ways of changing the rules. And yes, we do find that for new businesses and new industries to emerge, they have to influence the way that rules work, whether it's rewards or incentives to do this. Regulation might not be the first step, though, because sometimes they're more like, maybe we can call it more like quieter ways of changing rules. And these quieter ways come more in the form of norms and conventions.
Yeah.
Expectations. Let's change expectations. And these conventions and expectations come all the way to what is a handshake. So how do entrepreneurs change these types of expectations? Years ago, when some of these industries were starting, they were creating self-regulated codes of conduct to say, this is how we are going to go about this as an association. Whether today or more recently in fashion, we are seeing companies that are coming together with codes of conduct for their social contracts, which puts in self-regulation in terms of what chemicals are going to go into the textiles, right? What we're seeing is this idea of self-organizing and self-regulating. Even more informal, let's just start changing practices in a way that if we all start changing practices here and there, it becomes the expectation. So that polluting is no longer the advantage. It becomes riskier to pollute when we start changing behavior, right? Some companies in tech and finance started publishing emissions data, or they start in general enhancing transparency. Now, with enhancing transparency, that changes the game. Because now I know exactly how you're playing your game. You can't hide behind your curves because then it becomes a reputational issue.
Great. And if you're teaching, obviously also young entrepreneurs or future entrepreneurs, from the research that you have done, and if you ask them, those who want to go into this kind of entrepreneurship, what do you recommend to them? Like, what should they focus on, and maybe also in terms of their own abilities or capabilities? What do they need to have to be successful in this kind of entrepreneurial environment?
I think, and some of this is advice to any entrepreneur, right? But the first is to be flexible, to be adaptable, right? Because you might start with certain goals and ideas and realize that there's going to be some flexibility necessary down the way to adapt to what the market wants and what there is demand for sustainability, and for some of these other issues. There are other stakeholders involved. And so to also learn how to manage not just your customer, but also other stakeholders that are part of this system that we just talked about, right? Whether it's the government, whether it's community at large, other communities at large, that may also have a stake in what you're doing and may also want to have a voice. And also how to actually communicate that impact to those stakeholders is going to be a very important piece in entrepreneurship of this kind.
Great. And maybe a final word. I know you've been doing quite a lot of field research also, no? So when you talk about these kind of entrepreneurial projects, it's actually a lot of firsthand experience that you have interacting with entrepreneurs. Can you say a word about that, like where you have been and maybe what you found most exciting about it? I think that will be also interesting for this conversation.
We have done field projects in a variety of countries with Ghana, Colombia, Tunisia as well. Many of these projects have been looking and working with female entrepreneurs. Female entrepreneurs generally do have other greater limitations in growing their businesses, whether it's access to finance, whether it's access to networks. They do have greater limitations there, and also care responsibilities when it comes to families as well. How can we break some of these their general barriers to growing their businesses? And what has been interesting is that outside of these factors that I mentioned, there are other ways in which we can help, and some of it's how they structure the organizations, and others are more personal. Sometimes you will see an NGO that goes to a country like Ghana and to try to help women start businesses. And they will set up these businesses. They're meant to be cooperatives, so the women can share their assets and then share the gains at the end. But they start them and they make them very hierarchical, because some of these cultures, like for example, Ghana tends to be a very hierarchical culture. And what we find is that if you make these types of businesses very hierarchical, there's a misfit with how the incentives are supposed to go and the shared ownership and shared responsibility. When you make these businesses flatter, they actually do better. They're more stable. That's been, for example, one of our findings. Others have been that for women entrepreneurs, they're not only motivated by market and economic gains. It could be a food company, right? Or it could be a cosmetic company. But for women, when they see that they're helping their communities, what we find is that they're more motivated to grow. And then we also find, for example, that they tend to come in with a more of a scarcity mindset. Now, if you live in a context where there isn't that much, it's hard to not have a scarcity mindset. But what we found is that there's a way to change that, looking more at the resourcefulness and the resources that they have in hand. It's not just about you lacking financial resources. It's why don't you also look at the human capital, for example, your family, your neighbor, and what they can do to help. And what we find is that that makes a big difference.
Great. I'm glad I'm asked about that too, because I realize that this introduces a whole new topic, an additional topic. I think we need to close here because we already have a lot of a lot of material. So thank you for doing that, Desiree.
Thank you, Fred.